I will never forget my junior high guidance counselor and assistant principal, Mrs. Kathy Levison. She's the reason I became a nurse. Fast forward 25 years later, and now I have the honor of caring for her.
Miss Busher and Mrs. Crosby taught me it's easy to learn anything if you can find a way just to make it fun.
Professor Jim Globig at the University of Dayton recognized I was struggling and helped me find guidance to get through some tough times.
Coach Jim Place from Chaminade Julienne changed my life and is the reason I became a teacher.
Not all heroes wear capes, but teachers do have powers. Those unsung heroes have the incredible ability to shape lives. Michael Hamm of Troy, Ohio, says there were two men who made him who he is today, both coming into his life at just the right time, their pictures hanging on the walls throughout Michael's home.
The first teacher I always talk about as the first sort of unsung hero of my life is a man named Gene Steinke. The way we sort of crossed paths sort of happened by accident because I was, as a student with special needs, given an aide who was assigned to work in Gene's classroom. And his first questions to me upon meeting me had nothing to do with my disability or my wheelchair or anything that was outward. And he said, you know, you have a voice. He said, it's important for you to use it. And he said, how are you going to do that? And I said, I have no idea. Will you help me figure it out?
Gene encouraging him to hone in on his public speaking skills.
He focused on the things that I could do instead of my challenges physically, which was new to me as a disabled person. He said, well, what's your passion? What do you like? What do you think is important in life? Nobody really asked me that question before. This was the first man who was not far from my age, who made me believe that if you have a gift, you have to use it. He said it doesn't matter what you speak about, as long as you're passionate about it and you bring other people along with you. And I never forgot the way he made me feel. And I think that's the greatest lesson teachers bring out in students.
This style of teaching was the same method used by Gene's most memorable teachers.
You know, I think I was influenced by some of my best teachers that I had because that's really what mattered. It's just how they acted, how they carried themselves, and my interactions with them. And that's the stuff that you remember more so than any of the trivial stuff.
Education is a gift, but the knowledge is only potential power. How you use it matters. Gene gave Michael the inspiration. Sometime later, Scott Brewer gave him the blueprint to follow.
I always believed that you have to have your why, but you also have to have your how. Gene gave me my how as an 8th grader. When I got into high school, Scott gave me the why because he showed me that it wasn't just important to have a gift. Once you've got it, you've got to use it to help other people.
Scott, a history teacher, planting the seed for Michael to spread his message.
And I can still see him pacing up and down the rows of desks. And what Scott would do that was so amazing to me is that every lesson he would teach, he would sneak a life lesson in. I remember once he was talking about trench warfare, and he was talking to the students about, you know, these were the men that they put, the strongest men, the men that you wanted to fight alongside and die alongside and give your life to save theirs. And he said to the students, and I was just sitting in the back listening, much like I did with Gene, I said, he said, who do you love? And what would you give your life for? And something about that sparked something in me. He said, who are you going to love to your last heartbeat? And I didn't realize it. It took me about half a lifetime later that I was going to love these two men with my last heartbeat because of what they gave to me. And that's why I called the title of the piece that is really the center of my message, The Unsung Heroes, because I felt that society places the wrong emphasis on the type of hero. Because there is no greater hero in my mind than a teacher, because they empower you to do things beyond yourself.
The hand he was dealt, most people would have folded a long time ago, and no, he's playing it to the very end, and he's gonna really have an impact on people, on my life, on a lot of people's lives now and well into the future.
Good evening. My name's Tom Dunn, and I'm the former superintendent of the Troy City Schools. I was actually a superintendent when Michael was in school here. And actually, I met him in 2004, the year before I became superintendent. And maybe because I was a teacher of special needs students myself, we became kind of bonded at the hip. And so I have spent half of his lifetime with Michael. I have watched him grow from a young man who came to us from another state, who had been defined by his disabilities and the things that he couldn't do. And I watched, primarily because a group of teachers here at Troy Junior High and Troy High School decided to take a different track with him and talk to him about the things that he was capable of doing. And while the two gentlemen that you just saw in the video are going to get a lion's share of the praise, and they should, I think they would also say there has been two entire staffs at the junior high and the high school who played a major role in allowing Michael to develop into the young man that he has become. I had a front row seat to watch him grow from a young man who was told what he couldn't do to someone who became a nationally renowned speaker. He and I even spoke to different staffs around the state about what it means to truly be a teacher. I watched him become someone who was a leader within the building. I watched him graduate from Wright State University. I watched him write a book, Beyond the Challenges, a book of life lessons, which you can get on Amazon, by the way. I've watched him become employed for a long time by the Troy City Schools and be a very valuable member of their staff. I've watched him be a school board member now in his second term. And it's interesting, his senior year, he and I had a mentorship program, and he asked me to mentor him, and I tried to do that, but actually he mentored me as much as I mentored him. Because one of the things that I was reminded every day by Michael is that being a teacher is so much more than teaching them information that they can regurgitate for tests. And if we do our jobs right, like Gene and Scott did, and many other teachers did, we actually shape lives. And anytime that the pressure from outside tried to force us to do things other than take care of kids in the best possible way, Michael there was there to remind me that you're supposed to take care of us exactly the way you are. So Michael is going to talk to you about the heroes that impacted his life, but I can tell you that for many of us, Michael is our hero because we've watched what he has made of his life. And so now I introduce you, one of my favorite people in the world, Michael Ham.
Thank you, Mr. Dunn, and thank you to everyone here watching on the live stream and here in person. You know, this year marks 30 years since the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act. Not only did this groundbreaking piece of legislation grant every person with disabilities the right to live as full, productive members of society, but it also gave young people with disabilities the most fundamental gift we can give our young people, and that is the right to a free education outside the confines of an institution. I often think about the fact that my own scholastic career began 3 years after the ADA was enacted. This pivotal period in the history of our nation and the story of my own life allowed me to see a paradigm shift, not only in the attitudes of how we treat the disabled, but moreover how they are educated. When I began my scholastic career, I was placed in a multi-handicapped classroom, especially for those with physical, and intellectual disabilities. This mandate meant that someone in my position with purely physical challenges, once placed in this limited scholastic setting, would never achieve a high school diploma, let alone a college degree. While this way of thinking sounds extremely antiquated to us now, this was the norm in the school district in Central Florida where I was born. Now I'm cognizant of the fact in saying this that none of the decisions that were made by the early educators in that early part of my scholastic career were made out of any malice or ill will towards me. You know, we all come to decisions and conclusions based on the knowledge that is available to us at a certain point in time. I, as a young person with significant physical disabilities, presented the administrators with a certain set of needs. And they were responding to those needs with the resources and within the mandates that were available to them at the time. While I was eventually mainstreamed into a regular curriculum after 6 years in a restricted educational environment, this experience taught me a lot about perception. Even though those well-intentioned adults I mentioned followed the best practices and standards of the day, we have to be honest with ourselves and say that we all make judgments about people. They were making decisions about me based on what they thought I was capable of doing and being. And let's face it, we all do it at some point. The impressions we make on each other are made and broken in 5 minutes, both positive and negative. As you sit here today or listening online, how many of you can decide right away whether or not you're going to like someone? Most of the time, these impressions stick. You know, I believe the lessons which are the most important are the ones which come the hardest. And I was fortunate because I learned this early in my life. Because as dedicated as my mother was to my care and to the undeniable fact that my life would have some mission beyond my obvious physical challenges, my father was not. He believed that people with disabilities of any type should be institutionalized. And he rejected my mother's efforts to mainstream me into a regular curriculum, and he did his best to try to convince her to place me in a state-run facility. I always say that to her credit she refused, but it came at a cost. My father left when I was 10, leaving my mother to raise me on her own. Like she always did, though, my mother turned that negative into a positive. We moved to Troy, Ohio when I was 14 years old to be closer to my maternal grandfather, who up to that point had been the only real positive male role model in my life. But what that move did was it set me on a path that introduced me to my two heroes. You know, I was just at the beginning of my 8th grade year when we moved to Troy and I met a man named Chris Carnum. Chris was assigned to be my aide that year. He had the responsibility not only of seeing to my personal care, but he also had to make sure that I was in the right place at the right time. And as I reflect on this story that I'm sharing with you, I realize that the fact that you're even listening to this presentation at all is entirely Chris's fault. Now, as I say that, you have to understand that during my time as a student in Troy Junior High, if ever I needed something that required I find Chris, I could always find him in the room of a 7th grade social studies teacher named Gene Steinke. Now, I never quite figured out if Chris being in Gene's room all day was his method from hiding from me or not. But I soon learned that Chris being in that room was just as well, because it brought me in contact with the first unsung hero of my life, which is why I chose to entitle this presentation, The Unsung Heroes. You know, everyone has game-changing moments in our life that will forever change our direction and present us with a whole new outlook. For me, meeting Gene Steinke was one of those moments. What makes that story all the more unique is that but for the fact that Chris was in his room, there would have been little chance of Gene and my crossing paths. After all, I was in 8th grade and he taught 7th. And here we come to a fundamental understanding that anyone who works in education and wants to impact the lives of students understands. And that is, never waste one single opportunity to interact with a student. Whatever position you hold in the school, don't waste a single moment of time to make a difference in young people's life. And it has to be said, Gene certainly did not waste his opportunity with me. I always say that for me, meeting Gene was sort of like watching the sun come up for the very first time. You get excited, but you can't exactly pinpoint why. You know, Gene was early in his teaching career when I arrived in Troy, and he brought an enthusiasm and a fire to everything he did, which as a 14-year-old, I found infectious. His only goal was to positively impact the life of every student that entered into his classroom. You know, this was made evident through his earliest conversations with me, which, unlike a lot of the teachers in my previous district, had less to do with my physical challenges and that which I couldn't do. My conversations with Gene centered around that which I enjoyed, the abilities I had, and how I could use them to be successful. In other words, the things I could do. Something about these conversations gave me courage. All the teachers in Troy were so vastly different from where I'd come. But now here was a male role model who wasn't far from my age, telling me that while I had hardships, I equally had gifts and challenges which were uniquely mine. And the extent to which I would use them would determine my future. I spent the first few days after I met Gene in his room before school and after. I wanted to soak up all the knowledge and love and positivity he had to give. And it never failed that during the course of our conversations, which I treasured, a smile as big as the one from a Cheshire cat would split Gene's face. And as they did, I would often call to mind something that my grandfather said to me, and that was to find the mirrors in your life. Now, I have to confess to you, I had no idea what that meant until I met Gene. What my grandfather was doing was encouraging me to find those people in my life who reflected the qualities I wanted in myself as a young man. To this day, Gene is still that mirror for me. I could talk endlessly and without much provocation on the ways in which Gene changed the life of a young man in a time when he needed it the most. But I want to talk to you tonight about the two most important lessons I learned from this remarkable man. It's almost as if the best educators have a sixth sense which enables them to give their students exactly what they need when they needed it the most. For me, other than the fact that I am confined to a wheelchair, there would have been nothing that would have given Gene any indication that I needed so much of what he brought to my life. After all, my grades were above average, and I was never in any kind of trouble. Yet my interactions with Gene brought incalculable good to my life, less because of what he said, and more because of how it made me feel, in the things that I could contribute and that there were value in them. This proves that students will long forget what they learned in a textbook, but they never will forget how a teacher has made them feel. There are those people in life that bring joy and enthusiasm to every situation and every person they come in contact with. And hopefully we've all had them in our lives at some point or another. You know the ones, don't you? The ones who with a word or a look can lift our souls, lighten our spirits, and remind us that in a world where it's very easy to be negative, there are those invaluable things in life which make it worth living. That is what Jean did for me every day as a young person. By being for me everything that a big brother ought to be, and by giving me the self-assurance and support system that only a loving sibling could provide. One of my favorite memories is actually a venture into juvenile delinquency, because I would skip my study hall period every day at the end of the day just to hear him teach a lesson or be in his midst. He took the time to meet me where I was in life, and in so doing gave me a challenge to find the gifts and talents that were uniquely mine. Again, this is what the best teachers do every time they interact with students. Give them hope in their dark tunnels and enliven their passions. In our time together, Jean must have figured out that I was somewhat of a talker, because he encouraged me to try my hand at public speaking. This was always something I thought about, but Jean was the first one to propel my thoughts into action. Now understand what I'm saying here. At no time has Jean ever said that I could do anything I wanted to do, because he was well aware that given my limitations, that was simply not true. His greatest gift to me was the fact that he took time to look past the wheelchair to get to know the person inside, complete with the skills that I also possess. Classrooms all over the world are filled with students who have an untapped potential. All that is required is a teacher that cares to bring it out. And it has to be said, Jean came up with a unique way of getting my voice in front of an audience. On occasion, he would actually ask me to help him give a lesson. I guess he figured that as long as I was going to be there in the back of his room, he might as well put me to work. But he also allowed me to find my voice. And I realized that it sounds odd that a seventh grade social studies teacher would ask an 8th grade student to help them teach a lesson. But what he was doing was allowing me to talk about a subject matter I enjoyed. But in all honesty, he was helping me to realize that public speaking was my gift. It didn't matter that I had no idea what I was doing. All that was required of me was a willingness to stand up in front of him, next to him, in front of a group, and open my mouth. The lesson here is that we don't need a plan. We simply have to dare to do. You know, it's often said that the expert in anything was once a beginner. Well, through his love and support and constant encouragement, Jean helped me overcome the challenges of the past to write a whole new chapter. But in doing so, he laid the building blocks to my success story by showing me that he would always be there for me, but moreover by teaching me how to use my gifts and talents in order to make a difference. Jean showed me my how by allowing me to get up in front of a group in those early days and talk. I also needed to know my why. Do you know your why? It's that intangible thing that drives us to get up in the morning and face each day with determination and be grateful for every breath we take. For some people, it takes a lifetime to find their why. I was fortunate to begin the journey to my why when I was a freshman here at Troy High School, led by another hero. Interestingly enough, also a football coach who taught social studies. There's a theme that emerges in this story. I first came to know the man that we as students lovingly referred to as Brew. You heard his name is Scott Brewer, but we as students called him Brew during my freshman orientation, where he said to me, "You must be Michael. I hear you have a big mouth." Now, there are one of two ways you can take a statement like that, but thankfully I chose to take it as positive reinforcement. I assumed Gene or someone had told him about my first forays into public speaking. But the unfortunate thing was I couldn't spend too much time laughing over that entirely accurate appraisal of my personality, because then he lowered the boom on me. Have you ever had a friend or someone in your life who had the way or in an uncanny ability to state the truth plainly without ostentation? Or have you ever had a teacher in your life who seemed to understand life better than you did? Well, pay close attention, because I was about to hear one of the first of many Brewisms that would shape who I am. He then asked me, he said, "How are you going to use your mouth to help other people?" And I want to tell you, it was a good thing I was seated already, because a question like that can knock someone flat. Because so much time and energy had been expended by my mother, doctors, physical therapists, and a whole host of other well-meaning professionals tasked with the responsibility of making sure that I had all the help that I needed. Now here was someone who was challenging me to use my newfound gift of gab to help other people. In that moment, I found my why, to use those gifts and talents to better my corner of the world. Again, I had absolutely no idea how I was going to do this, but I knew I had to. And I knew that I was looking at someone who could help me figure it out. Let me assure you, Brew gave me more of an education than I could have ever asked for. Almost as if history repeated itself, Brew was in his first year teaching here at Troy High School when I met him, and he was in need of a student aide. And thankfully, he chose me, because like Gene before him, I wanted to spend every moment I could with him. And he encouraged me to join competitive speaking groups at the high school and to use my speeches as a platform which would call attention to issues that were important to me and to society in general. Not only did he encourage me to use my big mouth, but he also inspired me to use it as a force of good. I quickly learned that being a force of good was what Brew's life was all about. I have never seen anyone who puts more heart into everything he does. There's a part in the video you hear that rings true, and I can still see him in his early years teaching at Troy High School. He's one of those rare teachers that doesn't just teach social studies or a certain subject matter, but he makes it come alive. And when you least expect it, he sneaks a life lesson in. It was at these moments that I would sit in the back of the room and try to freeze time in my memory as not to miss a single word. And I would hear him say things like, "There's no such thing as a free lunch in this life. So when you get something that's good, don't keep it for yourself. Give it back." He would also say that life isn't about the degree of influence we have, the job we hold, or how much money we possess, but the extent to which we're willing to love unto our last heartbeat and do good for people when no one sees it. Looking back, these are very heavy concepts for students in high school, but Brew was one of those teachers that put his words into action. He was always there when his students needed him, with an ear to listen, an encouraging word, or a joke or a story that drew almost instantaneous laughter. And for his student aide with the big mouth, he went the extra mile. After I joined 2 competitive speaking groups at Troy High School, Brew was always on hand to be a captive audience when I needed to practice a speech. As a matter of fact, I think this is the only speech that I've ever done that I've not practiced in front of he or Jean. So I'll find out at the end what they think of it. But Brew never shied away from giving me an honest opinion of the speeches that I would give. I remember once that I had spent entirely too much time looking at the manuscript of a very carefully crafted speech. I thought it was pretty good. But Brew promptly stopped me and he said, "If you can't say what you believe from the heart, then shut up." It's a nice, gentle little saying, but it's without doubt my favorite Brewism. Because in that one sentence, Scott was giving me the greatest philosophy of life. That is to speak plainly, but speak from the heart. Because when you speak from the heart, people glimpse your character and they get to know you as you truly are. And today, when I give speeches at school districts or other places, or even talk to anybody, I call to mind these words. Because to me, what Scott was doing was a lot more than just sharing his time and advice with me. What he was doing was giving me a blueprint for living, which guides who I am today. When you think about it, no contractor would ever build anything without a guide or a blueprint as to how something is to be constructed. And our characters are formed in much the same way. Teachers are the main architects of who their students will become for a lifetime. You see, effective teachers don't just stand in front of a classroom and lecture on endlessly about facts and figures. They leave their fingerprint on the fabric of eternity by giving of their time to make their students better people. This is what Scott Brewer did for me that every day I was a student at Troy High School. My speeches did earn many accolades, one of them even garnering a national award. I know that high school is a time of memories that last forever. And don't get me wrong, I've had my fair share, but I think about a quote that I heard once, is that no learning can take place without relationships. Well, the greatest gift I took from my time as a student at Troy High School is my relationship with the man who taught me what it meant to be a truly good person. And in so doing, proving to me that life is all about the heart you're willing to put into it. In thinking about the roles that Jean and Scott played at pivotal moments in my life, we glimpse the reasons why teachers will tell you that they entered the profession in the first place, to make a difference. It seems that today educators of any type are only discussed in terms of the growth that they bring to a student academically. While that's certainly important, to define their roles in such limited terms is far too confining because they do so much more than that. Yes, both Jean and Scott did prepare me to be academically successful, but to characterize their work with me in just that regard would be a disservice to the wonderful job they did for me. I like to think of the two men who could always be counted on to tie my tie before a public speaking competition because I wasn't able to do it myself. And how, despite having the awesome demands of being fathers, husbands, coaches, and teachers presented, they were always there, they were always present to help me celebrate my victories, endure my challenges, and true to form, teach me one last lesson long after I had been graduated from college, and the textbooks from Troy Junior High School and Troy High School had long been closed. If my mother had one concern for me after raising me on her own, it was that if something were to happen to me, I would be on my own. She needn't to have worried, because when the time came, the man who I couldn't have been more proud to be his twin in the 8th grade, and the man she said was the answer to her prayer, Scott and Jean respectively, were on hand to teach me one last lesson, this time about family. When my mother passed away, Jean and Scott's mothers took on that surrogate role for me. And the same qualities I've always admired in Jean and Scott are manifest in their mothers. To know Jean's mom, Paula, is to gaze at those qualities in this life which are implicitly good and decent, kind. She is one of those people who everybody has something good to say about without question. I often say that Scott's mom, Clarice, is steel cloaked in velvet, fortified with an inner strength that allows her to give love to everything and everyone that comes in contact with her. I get so much inspiration from these women, just the way I did from the woman that brought me into the world and gave so much of who she was to me. And now that she's gone, Clarice and Paula are constant reminders of a mother's love and the kind of people that we should surround ourselves with always. Knowing them makes it easy to see why Jean and Scott became such effective educators and coaches. You know, we say words like mom or dad so often that it's easy to take them for granted until you can't any longer. You know, the father that I was born with never allowed me to call him dad. And I learned that that is a title that is to be deserved. Thankfully, Jean's dad, Big Gene, does allow me to call him dad. And because he does, he teaches me one important lesson, that a true father's love, a dad's love, isn't based in one's abilities or disabilities, but in exactly that, unconditional love. Of all the good that Jean and Scott have brought to my life, I believe this is the most important lesson, and the one for which I am the most grateful. The undeniable fact that family is not defined by DNA, but by love. And I've often thought that I'm pretty certain that that skill and that ability was not something that was ever discussed in their teaching manuals. It is quite possible that you forget everything I say today. Educators who work every day in the best interest of students change lives in more ways than one could ever hope to imagine. And that is the one thing I ask you to remember. I would encourage every student who hears this message to thank a teacher that has had a positive impact on their life. I hope that my life has been a thank you note of sorts to the time, attention, and love that Jean and Scott have brought to me, and for the ways they took a boy without a father who was physically disabled and taught him to be a man who wasn't defined by those physical challenges, but by the strengths he possessed to better the world and make it a better place. Educators like Jean and Scott save lives every time they interact with students with the goal of helping them to become better people. You know, I view a teacher's role in our society as similar to that of air. We can't see it, but it's always there. We can't live without it. That's what makes Jean, Scott, and other teachers like them the unsung heroes of our age. Thank you very much.